Hi, everybody. It's great to be back together. This is a wonderful series. We've been looking at the book of Genesis, and this week is our final portion of the book of Genesis. It's called Vayechi. And I'm Rabbi Steve Einstein, the founding Rabbi Emeritus of Congregation B'nai Tzedek in Fountain Valley. And I have two wonderful colleagues and dear friends with me. And I'd like each of them to say a word about themselves. So why don't we start with Rabbi Heidi Cohen.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I am Rabbi Heidi Cohen, and I am with HaNefesh, OC, and Jew by You. And this is awesome being together with my amazing colleagues and friends as we get to tackle this incredible final chapter of the book of Genesis. So, Rabbi Nancy Meyers.
Hi, I'm Rabbi Nancy Meyers. I'm the rabbi of Temple Beth David in Westminster. I'm now in my 18th year, and 18 comes from the Hebrew, connects with the Hebrew word life. And it's definitely been giving me a lot of life over these 18 years. And I'm so glad to be with my colleagues here to discuss the very end of the book of Genesis as well.
I'm the senior rabbi of Orange County, and if my history serves me well, I think that Rabbi Meyers, you have made history. I think that you are the longest serving rabbi of Temple Beth David.
According to Rabbi Michael Meyerson, I am. That is correct.
Yeah, and that's wonderful, quite an accomplishment, and kol hakavod, and may you continue leading the congregation and go from strength to strength and in good health. Today, we always are concerned about everybody's good health. So I want to start by showing a prop, if I may. It's this. Very often when I speak with school groups or church groups and we talk about the Bible, I will say to people, you may have a Bible in your home, or you may have one in a school. Some of the students have it on their desk, or certainly on their phone. I said, you think you have the Bible, but you don't. It's not the Bible. And of course, they're already starting to get huffy, thinking this rabbi is insulting them. And I'm saying, no, I'm going to show you the Bible. And then I pick up this book and I show it to them. I say, this is the Bible. So if this is the Bible, and I'm asserting that what you have is not the Bible, what is it that you have? And of course, they realize they have a translation of the Bible. And we're often running on that. But you can probably tell I've had to repair this book. I've had it a very long time. And with your permission, colleagues, I just want to tell the brief story of how I happened to get this book. I started rabbinical school the week before I graduated from high school. In those days, the Hebrew Union College used to recruit us very young. And I had decided when I was at Camp Saratoga, which is the forerunner of Camp Swig and then Camp Newman, this is what I'd like to do in my life. And so just as I was beginning UCLA, I also started at HUC. And during my 4 years as an undergraduate, took courses at the rabbinical school. And once we got enough Hebrew down, we then went to start studying the Tanakh, the Bible, in Hebrew. And the very first area that we were going to look at was the Joseph Saga, which we are now completing this week, mostly because it's a story and the Hebrew is pretty straightforward. So I had to go get a Tanakh, a Hebrew Bible. I didn't own a Hebrew Bible at that point. I went to Fairfax. That was the Jewish center of life in Los Angeles in those days. And while many people went to Solomon's bookstore for these things, which was kind of like our golden dreidel, and that's where I had gone to get my bar mitzvah talis. For books, there was another store on the street that had a bigger selection called Hershkovitz. So I went to Hershkovitz bookstore, and I said I needed a Tanakh. And so Mr. Hershkovitz asked me where I was studying, and I said at the Hebrew Union College, to which he said, even the reformers haven't changed this book, which I thought was true. kind of funny.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, we haven't changed the book, and all three of us happen to be Reform rabbis. But I think that our movement, and together with the conservative and the Reconstructionist movements and so on, do offer newer ways of looking at the text. We all share the same text, but how we look at the text may differ. And so to see how three different rabbis sitting here in Orange County look at this final Torah portion, I'd like to first call on Rabbi Meyers, because you always have a really interesting twist. That's what I find in our discussions, Nancy. So how do you look at this closing portion of this book of Genesis?
Oh, another thing that's so fascinating, Vayechi, and that Jacob lived. It starts off by telling us that our patriarch Jacob, whose name is Israel, he lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years. And we know that this Torah portion is going to have two deaths in it, the death of Jacob and then the death of Joseph. And it's interesting. And exactly, this really concludes the story of Joseph. And it goes all the way back 3 weeks ago, Vayechi, where Joseph was 17 years old when his whole story starts to unfold, when his father gives him the multicolored tunic. He has his antagonistic relationship with his brothers, sets into stage them actually throwing him into the pit, selling him to the Ishmaelites, the Midianites. And that whole story is going to come up right here in this Torah portion, this great finale, where Jacob is on his deathbed. He implores his son Joseph to not bury him in Egypt. And that's fascinating, isn't it? Insists, begs him, take him back to Israel, bury him in the cave of Machpelah so he can lie with his ancestors. And then the question behind that is, why is that the case? Why is it so important for Jacob to be buried back in the land of Israel? And it makes you think a bit about, how important is it to us? Where are we going to be buried? How important is it? Some people have already procured their own burial plots now. Other people have postponed it. I've actually already in the process of getting myself a plot, which seems sort of odd. I'm only 52 years old, but where is our final resting place? And how do we see that? So for Jacob, it's very important that he's going to be buried in the land of Israel. And Joseph, that he makes his brothers promise him that when he dies at the age of 110, and he's embalmed. In Judaism, you don't embalm. That when they come out of Egypt, hundreds of years later, he says, don't forget my bones. And there's a whole story behind that, but I'm going to turn this over to Rabbi Heidi Cohen. It's just such a powerful Torah portion.
I totally agree with you, Rabbi Meyers. This whole idea of, that thinking about both of them, Jacob and Joseph, considering and sharing with their family their desires for where to be buried and not to forget them. First of all, Rabbi Einstein, thank you so very, very much for sharing that story of your first, Tanakh there that, is so loved. And we know how much a book is loved by how it folds, and opens up and easily just, comes open before us. And that's exactly what Torah does. It opens before us and it allows us to explore it, and it calls to us to not only just read the words that are there on the parchment or on the page, but to really ask some of the challenging questions, the hard questions. What does this have to do for me? What is the meaning of this? And especially as we're looking at the relationships too, because the relationships that we see between Jacob and his own family, and then later, of course, with Joseph and his brothers, is so complex. I mean, starting weeks ago with, Jacob, who loved Joseph the most, giving him that beautiful multicolored coat that really became an object of jealousy and hatred from the other brothers, going, who are you that our father loves more, and that resentment. And then, of course, leading them to thankfully not kill him, but rather sell him into slavery and taking him down to the land of Egypt, which we can look at all the different perspectives with that. as to, hindsight 2020 to say, well, wait a second, this was a good thing to happen because then we get the rest of the story that will then, continue, of course, in the book of Exodus. But when we look at this and we consider how Joseph and Jacob give those instructions and bless, by the way, I am so taken by, of course, Jacob once again doing exactly what was done with him, right? Of blessing Joseph's younger son before the older, crossing his hands there. Jacob then blessing his own sons. And actually, sometimes we would ask, were there even blessings? But then at the very end, with how we see with Joseph struck by, this whole idea that his father is no longer there. But this idea too, though, it's not only about the relationship with his dad, the relationship of his dad with God, or his grandfather with God, or his great-grandfather with God, but that Joseph also recognizing that God of Israel, Vayechi, that is going to still live, is still there, and that whole connection that's going to continue. That even when we find ourselves in slavery, that while God we may not see there in that presence for those hundreds of years, doesn't forget, and that continuation of that relationship.
Thank you. That was a very important lessons, both of you. I want to go back to one thing that Rabbi Meyers said about selecting a burial plot. First of all, today, there are people who say, well, the Jews have only been in Israel, since like 1948. This is a modern thing. And in fact, when we read this text, we realize it goes back. Our connection to the land goes back to the very beginning. And this idea of being buried in the land, we have first Jacob making this request. Later, at the end of the book, Joseph says to his descendants that the time will come when God will redeem us from Egypt, and we will be going back and take my bones with you. And for centuries, when Jews weren't living in large numbers in Eretz Israel, there's always been a presence of Jews, by the way. It's not as if there were no Jews there, but most Jews for many hundreds of years lived outside of the land. And yet it was often the case that people would go to Eretz Israel for their final days, to live out the end of their life and to be buried there, this idea of being buried there. And even now, when we live, those of us who do live chutz la'aretz, we live in the diaspora, it is very common, and the rabbis know this because we do this all the time, that people will request a bag of earth from Israel to be placed with them in the casket. Yeah, exactly. They want to be connected to the land of Israel. So that really does go back. Also, Rabbi Cohen, you talked about the blessing of Joseph blessing, Jacob blessing his grandsons, Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And it's shown very graphically in the text where he crosses his hands because Joseph presents his sons to his father so that his father would have Manasseh, who was the elder, at his father's right hand, and Ephraim, the younger, with the idea, you of course bless the older with the right hand. My apologies to those who were left-handed here, but the text was written by probably primarily by right-handed people. And so that was the idea. And his father, of course, made a switcheroo and crossed his hands so that the first blessing, shall we say the choice blessing, went to the younger, to Ephraim. This is a fascinating theme that the Bible returns to over and over and over again. Our ancestors seem to be uncomfortable with the prevailing custom, not only the custom amongst our people, but the custom amongst our neighbors of primogeniture, that the firstborn son was the leader, because as we know, the firstborn child, whether it be the firstborn son or not, could be firstborn daughter, isn't necessarily the natural leader. And over again, the Bible points us in the direction, something we can, I think, all relate to. Go for the person who has the skills. Let each person rise to their own skill level. Don't place people into a spot because of their, shall we say, the accident of the order of their birth. I think that that's an important thing. The other thing I'd like to mention is, again, going back to what had been said, that blessing from Jacob, he was really honest talking to his children. He didn't hold back. This wasn't sugar-coated. He did it in the form of a poem, but if they had messed up during their lives or their character flaws were so obvious to everybody else, he didn't hide them at this point, which was pretty interesting, because it's a challenge we as rabbis have, right? When we have to give a eulogy for somebody. And generally, we're not so straightforward about talking about people's weaker points. We all have our weaker points. We want to remember the more positive points, but maybe it's good for us to look at our own ancestors and question, they weren't all heroic. None of us is totally heroic. That we're knowing and learning more and more. Okay, who has another idea you'd like to pop up with right now?
Just react to. I love what you both just said. Rabbi Cohen about blessing itself. It's just so powerful, and it was making me think a little bit. In the Torah, they believe blessing was prophecy, was a way of foretelling the future. May you be blessed with ample grain, and they believed it would come true. Today, we still bless our kids today, but do we believe it's prophecy, or is it more of an expression of this innermost wish and hope that we have? There's a beautiful moment. Actually, Seth Front, who is the son of Rabbi Henry Front, Rabbi Einstein, you knew him, he expressed concern to me one day. He said, every Friday night, my father would bless us and bless me, but I've always been worried, who blesses my father? What about my father? And I said, you know what? His parents blessed him. And so in his time, he blesses you, and you bless your children. L'ador v'ador. So there's a lot of power to that itself. There's the whole idea of blessing, I think, permeates this, but I also found it very relevant, Rabbi Einstein, when you're talking about that, the oldest doesn't always become the inheritor, doesn't always become the one that the oldest one is not the one who always inherits. I mean, we see that with Reuben, who's the firstborn of Jacob and Leah, but yet it's Judah who's the one who will have priority later on. And I love that's a beautiful modern drash about our own personal capabilities and talents, which I think is really interesting. And that plays out certainly throughout our Torah portion. So I find that very meaningful. And I know Rabbi Cohen was going to react as well. Something that I'd love to see us get to at the end, if we're able to, is the power of forgiveness, of why Joseph, it comes up again, in last week's Torah portion also, when Joseph is finally reunited with his brothers, and his brothers are scared that he's going to take vengeance on them. And he says, it was part of God's plan. It was, even though you intended harm for me, this was God's plan to put me here so I could save us. Once again, when Jacob passes away, Joseph's brothers are scared that was the only thing holding him back from taking revenge. And they offer themselves as slaves to him. And he says, once again, this was part of God's plan. It's okay. We're going to let things go. And that just takes an incredible, what does that take? To not hold a grudge, to let it go. And that's just an astounding quality that Joseph has.
I would like to call on Rabbi Cohen. And then to wrap it up, some of you may have seen that as Rabbi Meyers was talking, I jumped up out of my seat to grab a prop. And I think that I have the perfect way to end today's session. So after Rabbi Cohen speaks, this is a follow-up to something that was said that I think everybody will enjoy thoroughly. Go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you. So in just first of all, addressing with the blessings, you're right. I mean, just the power of the words that Jacob gives in his poem, of being able to say, everything that he wants to say to his sons. Now, of course, we can go into, and we would have to spend a whole other session talking about, well, wait a second, there were daughters, we know for sure of Dinah, but we're not going to go there. I know we don't have time. But, looking at how it is that Jacob speaks to his sons, and it is not always in pleasantness, but it is straightforward. It is direct. And that right there is the blessing. How often do we not speak directly? Do we not always put everything out there? We sugarcoat things. And if anything, right here, Jacob is reminding us of, what? Life is real. How are we able to be real with kindness, with compassion, having that chesed, of course, and the respect of people, but also being real there. And then, just very quickly, with Joseph and that power of forgiveness, that not holding that grudge, but rather Joseph seeing that bigger picture, just as we do with the hindsight 2020, to be able to look at his brothers and to say, I love you, because ultimately with our families, it's unconditional love in there. Now, yes, we can definitely say there are absolutely moments where is that boundary? And that's another whole session. But with Joseph, he looks at his brothers and he says, I love you, through that power of his being able to forgive and to say, but this is why we're here. This is why everything happened the way that it did, so that we can be here, because we still have a great journey that is before us. Rabbi Einstein, you have something to share with us. I'm excited to see what you got. Go ahead, bring it home.
So this is a follow-up to the question that Seth Front had asked, told in the story to Rabbi Meyers. On the night before my ordination, we had a consecration service at Rockdale Temple in Cincinnati. And one of our professors, Rabbi Ben-Zion Wacholder of blessed memory, was the speaker. You remember him. And he framed his comments this way. He said, as rabbis, you will be blessing people. You offer blessings at a bris and a baby naming, a consecration, a bar and bat mitzvah, confirmation, weddings. You're blessing people all the time. And so the question then needs to be asked, as you rabbis are blessing everybody, who will bless the rabbis? And he gave the answer. He said, the people will. And this has always been very dear to me. I've talked about it often through the years, because so often this has been true. Not always, but often, mostly. And my sister-in-law, Hani Kessler-Amato, created a beautiful needlepoint for me with this question and answer, and who will bless the rabbis? The people will. And I always placed it right next to my smicha, next to my ordination certificate. It hung in my office at Congregation B'nai Tzedek. And after my retirement, I brought it here to my study at home. And I'd like to conclude by showing it to everybody. And so
that's beautiful. That's nice. That's so touching.
To all of the people who are watching, as we conclude this series of the book of Genesis, we thank you for being with us, for sharing with the study and the learning of all of our rabbis here in Orange County. And just as we bless you, we ask that you too offer your blessing, your good wishes to all of our rabbis. Ken Yehi Ratzon.
As we conclude the book of Genesis, may we go from strength to strength as we begin the book of Exodus.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.